talking about 20 minutes.
Yeah, 15, 20. Yeah. All right, ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. And we will begin the panel on populism, moving from the dismal science to something maybe just as dismal. And to help us think about this, we have two experts on the topic. First, Bill Galston, who holds the Ezra K. Zilkha Chair at the Brookings Institution. Previously, he was professor and acting dean of the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland, director of the Institute for Philosophy and Public Policy, and executive director of the National Commission on Civic Renewal. A participant in 6 presidential campaigns, he served from 1993 to 1995 as deputy assistant to President Clinton for domestic policy. He's the author of 9 books, most recently Anti-Pluralism, The Populist Threat to Liberal Democracy. He is also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and writes a weekly column for the Wall Street Journal, which I read. Followed by Sheri Berman, professor of political science at Barnard College, Columbia University. Her research interests include European history and politics, the development of democracy, populism and fascism, and the history of the left. She has written about these topics for a wide variety of scholarly and non-scholarly publications. She currently serves on the boards of the Journal of Democracy, Dissent, and Political Science Quarterly, and her most recent book, Democracy and Dictatorship in Europe, From the Ancien Regime to the Present Day, was published in 2019. Thank you both for making the trip to be here, and give you a round of applause for that. And Bill Galston.
Well, thanks so much, Ed. As you might be able to infer from my voice, I had some travel interruption, shall we say, on the way back from Texas late last night. But I'll try to keep up my energy level for 20 minutes anyway. My remarks might well be entitled Populism 101. I am not breaking an inch of new ground. I'd just like to provide a foundation for the more sophisticated presentation that you'll hear in 20 minutes or so. I've divided my presentation into 6 parts for you compulsive note takers. Part 1, the nature of populism. What is it, roughly speaking, that we're talking about? Well, as you might infer, from the name, it is a stance towards politics that's double-edged. Number 1, it's against the elites. Who are the elites? It varies. For some on the left, it's economic elites. For many on the right, it's cultural elites. Each form of populism has its own roster of enemies, frequently specific to particular countries. Well, if it's against the elites, who's it for? The people. But who are the people? There's the rub. Are the people all of the people, or the real people? AKA people who've been here for a long time, people born of native stock, et cetera, et cetera. There is typically a concept of the real people, the portion of the population that's the salt of the earth, the people who represent the real values of the country, whatever they may be. It's not just a people, it's this people, right? And so, populism is not a form of universalism like Marxism or liberalism, for that matter. It is very specific and particularistic. It represents in many cases, most cases I would say, a mobilization of grievances and resentments, more on that. And it often features a sense of displacement or loss on the part of the people who are particularly open to the populist appeal. Number two, the characteristic demographic base of populist movements, parties, and governments. They tend to come from small towns and rural areas. In much of the West, areas abandoned by classic industries such as manufacturing, mining, and other extractive industries. Populists tend not to be dense on the ground in capital cities and in areas with a high education level, which brings me to my next point. The characteristic base of populist movements is not exclusive, but I would say characteristic, is among citizens with less than a college degree. And you heard in the previous panel what some of the consequences of that so-called education divide can be. Populists tend to represent dominant groups, dominant religious groups, ethnic groups, or what have you, groups who feel that they ought to be in charge, but for reasons that they don't quite control, are not. 3, populism as a form of government when it is allowed to govern. It is strongly majoritarian, and in that sense, it associates itself with and gets the halo of democracy. As a matter of fact, populists also typically insist that they are the true Democrats and that the people they oppose are opponents of democracy because they do not believe that the will of the people should be translated straightforwardly into public policy and law. For this reason, populist movements and governments tend to be impatient with checks on majority power. And many of these checks are institutional, which means that populists have a very uneasy and often hostile relationship with the institutional structures within which they function and through which they have come to power. They're impatient with restraints on majority power, both at the individual and minority group level, and also, as I said, at the institutional level. Populist movements and governments tend to feature a direct, unmediated relationship between the people and a charismatic definitional leader, many, although not all, of whom are male. And a final characteristic of populist governance, to which I'll return, is the willingness of populists to use public power in both the economy and the culture. These people are the antithesis of small government conservatives, which is why the rise of populism within the United States has been associated with an all-out attack on small government conservatives and on libertarianism, which is their favorite whipping boy, because populists are opposed to everything that libertarians espouse and vice versa. 5, characteristic positions of populist movements and governments. What do they stand for and push for? As you may have inferred, cultural traditionalism, especially around family and gender issues. And this plays out in different ways in the United States and in Europe, but part of the populist admiration for Vladimir Putin, in addition to the fact that he wields power with relish and abandon, is that he is alleged to stand for traditional values. If you oppose gay rights, transgenderism, believe in the family is nuclear with one man and one woman, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you are singing from the populist hymnal. And as we've seen in the United States, if you sing from that hymnal, you can be forgiven a multitude of other sins. Populists believe in public subsidies for individuals and also for favored businesses and sectors. Certainly, and this is Sheri's territory, but I'll just use it as an example. If you look at the successes of the recently defeated populist government in Poland, it was built in no small measure on direct checks to individuals and families. Populists have employed, this device of direct, unmediated economic benefits for individuals and favored groups to great political advantage. Among other things, and this can be literally the case, the leader signs the government checks, right? So you have this direct relationship between a check that an individual receives and the authorizing signature on the check. This happened in the United States in 2020. Populist movements and governments are typically anti-immigrant for a host of reasons, and opposition to immigration turns out to be a major mobilizer for populist movements and governments. And I would argue, although I don't have time to argue the case in detail, that populists inherently drive towards a kind of homogeneity in the society. They want everybody to toe the line that the dominant group represents. They are, in that very strong sense, anti-pluralist. Whenever populists hear sentences like, our diversity is our strength, they want to reach for their guns, because that's exactly the opposite of what they believe. They believe that homogeneity is strength, and homogeneity that they define and then use the power of government to enforce. So, sixth and finally, what are the dangers that populism represents, and what are intelligent and feasible responses to those dangers? Well, I think you've already figured out from what I just said that populism is illiberal to the core, because liberalism represents checks on public power in the name of liberties and freedom for individuals and minority groups that otherwise would fare poorly at the hands of the majority. This has led a prominent European populist leader, Viktor Orban, to style what he stands for as illiberal democracy. But there's a problem with that formulation, because it may seduce you into believing that there is no relationship between liberalism and democracy so that you can have the latter without the former. In practice, it's not so simple, because when populists get power or seek power, what you see is intense pressures on the institutions that create and sustain a zone of liberty for individuals and minority groups, because those liberties are not self-protecting. They need to be protected, not only by public sentiment, but also by institutions. And so you typically see pressure on institutions such as a free press, an enduring civil service, an independent judiciary, and civil society organizations, who are accused of receiving funds from foreign actors, of abusing their status to become political actors, even though they're not supposed to be, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And a final, but I believe critical, danger of populism, because of the direct relationship between a leader and the people, is the tendency to concentrate power in the executive branch, and to subordinate other parts of the governmental mechanism, and to govern in effect by the will or whim of the executive, as opposed to orderly democratic processes. Now, if you're with me so far, finally, what to do about all of this? What I've just described, I believe, is one of the most important threats, other than autocracy, to liberal democracy in the world today. And in some respects, it's harder to combat because it occurs within democracies. It's an internal problem as opposed to an external problem, although the relationship between the internal and the external can be deep and dangerous, as you see propaganda from autocrats trying to strengthen illiberal forces within the democracies in order to get more friends in the world, and also to weaken countries like the United States. So I've made a short list of 4 responses. I could have made a longer list, but these are pretty important. Number 1, and this ties in with remarks in the previous panel, address specific grievances, legitimate grievances. I characterized populist movements earlier, as a coalition of the aggrieved. These grievances, in many cases, are not made up, right? They represent legitimate complaints by people, who have been left behind, who believe that they're invisible and unheard, and that the modern economy and society have been arranged so as to disadvantage them. So step number 1, take those grievances seriously and think about ways of addressing them. Number 2, to the extent that there are deep differences in the society that express themselves in anti-liberal movements, to the extent compatible with liberal democracy, allow diversity to find expression. And that means, first of all, not trying to impose a single template on civil society organizations, many of which will reflect organizing principles that are neither liberal nor democratic. And number 2, to the extent that constitutional arrangements permit, and these vary from country to country, take advantage of federalism, as a venue for the expression of difference that could also serve as a kind of pressure release valve. If all policies are nationalized, then conflict is nationalized and deepened. And I think some of what we're now wrestling with is the drive that spans the past 3 generations to nationalize every important issue in the country. I think that there were some good reasons for doing that, but this may have gone too far. Third, whenever possible, create limits on the excesses of executive power. The one that scares me the most in this country is the Insurrection Act, which, as many of you know, gives the president almost unchecked authority to deploy the U.S. military, the Posse Comitatus Act to the contrary notwithstanding. As a reading assignment, yes, I used to be a professor. I have only one and it's very short. Read the Insurrection Act and be prepared to gasp at the potential extent of the president's power to call people in this room into active duty, for domestic purposes. And number 4, zealously defend the institutions that make democracy liberal. Attacks on the free press are attacks on liberal democracy. Attacks on the independence of civil society are attacks on liberal democracy. Whatever your venue is, push back against those attacks because, as institutions like those are subtly weakened, the threat to liberal democracy grows. Thank you very much.
How do I get the slides up? Oh, okay, great. And do I have a?
You have a clicker, yeah. It's right here. And if you do the down button, there, that'll work, the down.
The down will go to the next one. Okay, great. It's my pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me. So, as some of you may know, 2024 has been proclaimed the year of democracy. And the reason for this is that we are going to have more people than ever before going to the polls. At least 64 countries and the European Union are going to be holding elections this year. But despite the fact that this is the year of democracy, there is incredible pessimism about democracy, as evinced by the very fact that we are having this conference. So why is there so much pessimism? Well, this chart, which I hope you can kind of see, gives you one reason for that, namely that over the last decade and a half or so, there has been a decline in the number of democracies that exist across the globe. But I would say, while this is certainly something that should sadden us, it might not entirely surprise us, since many of the democracies that have declined are new democracies, that is to say, democracies that only came into being at the end of the 20th or the beginning of the 21st century. So their decay should certainly sadden us, but again, perhaps not surprise us. What is perhaps particularly worrying, and I suspect worrying a lot of people in this room, is that many people worry about the fate of democracy even in places where it has long been taken for granted, where it has been established for a very long time, like the United States. And I'm going to talk a little bit about another part of the world today where that is also true, namely Western Europe. So this brings me to the topic of this particular panel, which is populism, because as my colleague Bill said, populism is generally considered to be the greatest threat to democracy in places like the United States and Western Europe, where it has been long taken for granted. I'm going to focus my comments on the right-wing version of populism because that is the more politically powerful version, although I should say that I think that term right-wing is a little misleading. These parties that I'm going to discuss are generally right-wing on social and cultural, but not actually on economic issues, so I will perhaps get back to that. So actually, these parties have done, right-wing populist parties have really done extremely well in Western Europe, particularly since the financial crisis, but over the last few years more specifically. So in 2022, we got an election in Italy that brought the Brothers of Italy to power. It's made its leader, Giorgia Meloni, the first female prime minister of Italy. In Sweden, the Sweden Democrats, that right-wing populist party there, became the second largest party in parliament and is now a crucial support for the right-wing government that exists there. Marine Le Pen received her best results yet in the French election in 2023. Geert Wilders' Party for Freedom won a remarkable victory. The Finns party came in second in the elections. And this year, if polls hold, we will get a right-wing populist party becoming the largest party in Austria, and generally right-wing populists are expected to perform really well in the upcoming European elections in June. So there are some important similarities between right-wing populism in Western Europe and its counterpart in the United States. So one, Bill talked a little bit about, and we heard a little bit about in the previous panel, which is economic causes. So generally, scholars who study populism have found that things like globalization, trade shocks, rising inequality and insecurity, the fallout from austerity, all of these things are correlated with growing support for these parties. Another similarity, again, also mentioned just previously, is that the people who vote for right-wing populist parties, similar in Western Europe and in the United States. The populist voters are drawn disproportionately from low-income, low-educated groups, from rural citizens, that is to say, again, people who are suffering a lot from economic dislocation and change. Another similarity is that populists mobilize primarily around social and cultural grievances. So when you think about right-wing populist parties, even though they draw disproportionately from groups suffering from economic change, the thing that they really focus on are these social and cultural grievances. However, and you will hear more about this in the following panel, the connection between these social and cultural grievances and populist voting is not as straightforward as is often presented. So when we think about social and cultural grievances, one thing that is quite striking is that there's actually very little cross-national correlation between levels of things like racism and xenophobia, anti-immigrant sentiment, and populist support. Right? So there are some countries, I mentioned Sweden before, where actually by all polls things like racism and xenophobia are quite low, but yet you have a very popular right-wing populist party. Then there are other countries where by all accounts, comparative polls like Ireland, where racism and xenophobia are relatively high, where actually you do not have a very powerful right-wing populist party. There's also little correlation over time between these kinds of attitudes or sentiments and populist voting. So generally, despite what we might think from listening to newscasts and angry folks all over the place, there has been a general, not as much as there should be, but a general progressive cosmopolitan trend in attitudes, right? That is to say, people have become more liberal generally and more accepting over time, but support for populism of the right-wing variety has grown. What has happened, though, that is causally significant is that over about the last decade and a half, the views of highly educated people with the BAs that Ann Case talked about before, have gotten very, very progressive and cosmopolitan on these kinds of issues. Those attitudes have changed much more rapidly than those of more low-educated, low-income voters, whose attitudes have just changed much less rapidly than those of educated voters over about the last decade and a half. And what this has done is created a real gap between those groups in their attitudes on these issues. And as Professor Case also mentioned, since these more progressive folks have now begun to vote disproportionately for the left, it's also created a gap between parties of the left and more low-educated, low-income voters on these issues, and this is a gap that right-wing populists have really exploited, as Professor Galston, or as Bill said, to create a sense that cultural elites and the parties that they vote for are really quite disconnected from regular voters. Okay, so there are some similar causes of right-wing populism in both the US and in Western Europe, but here's where the big difference comes. They've had very different trajectories. So beginning in the late 20th century, we began to see right-wing populist parties emerging across the scene in Western Europe. But when these parties first emerged in Western Europe, these were really far-right parties. These were quite radical parties. They were openly racist and anti-Semitic. They were rooted in or grew out of neo-fascist movements. They had very, very questionable commitments to democracy. But in this form in Western Europe, these parties achieved relatively little success. Their vote shares remained relatively low. They were shunned by other political parties. They were often not covered highly in the media. And partially for this reason, these right-wing populist movements and parties began to transform in the early 21st century in Western Europe. What do I mean by that? They began to shift their profiles. They distanced themselves from their extremist and fascist roots. They eschewed open racism and anti-Semitism, and they proclaimed their commitments to democracy. So a classic example for this, one of the oldest and most powerful right-wing populist parties in Western Europe is the National Front, right? So this is its first leader, Marine Le Pen, as you can tell. Jean-Marie Le Pen. As you can tell, he's a quite angry older fellow, right? So this party emerges from the far-right scene in France in the 1970s. During its early years, it garners few votes. Its vote share expands somewhat in the 1990s and early 2000s, but it falls back, sort of getting stuck at about 4.3%. He gets about 4.3% in the 2007 presidential elections. Now, it was clear, people understood that this party's success was limited by its radicalism, and in particular by the racism and Holocaust denialism of this fellow. I mean, he was an actual Holocaust denier. All right, and so what do? You get a palace coup and a takeover of the party by Jean-Marie's daughter, Marine Le Pen. And that's her here with her cats. I have to say this bothers me. I'm a cat lover, so the fact that she portrays herself as that sort of gets under my skin. But in any case, so she forces her father out of the party, and she begins a concerted effort to de-demonize the party. She changes the party's rhetoric on its signature issue of immigration. She distances herself from open racism and anti-Semitism. She says she objects to immigration because she wants people to assimilate and because it has negative economic consequences. She shifts her party also, by the way, very much to the left on economic issues in general. She wants to protect the welfare state. She's skeptical of globalization and free trade, yada, yada, yada. To signal her responsibility and the change in her party, she surrounds herself with often very technocrats, many of whom are defectors from conservative and other center-right parties. This is the new president of our party, this young fellow here. He obviously is a very different type of politician than the father. I mean, he's young, he's attractive, he's reasonable, he has a somewhat of an immigrant background even. And in the run-up to the last election, she tries to moderate her party's image even further, not only, as I said, by portraying herself as a caring mother of cats. This was a big part of her appeal. But she changes the party's name from the National Front to the National Rally. She drops her rejection of the European Union. She supports Ukraine after being accused of being a Putin supporter, and yada, yada, yada. Okay, so the evolution of other right-wing populist parties in Western Europe follows this trend very much. So the Sweden Democrats, who I mentioned before, the Brothers of Italy, all of these groups, again, rooted in extremist, even neo-Nazi movements, but over time, their leaders really try hard to distance themselves from these roots and to portray themselves, again, as committed to, willing to play very much within the democratic rules of the game. So this is one reason why scholars who study, think tanks who study democracy have not identified any significant democratic decay in Western Europe. What do I mean by that, right? So democratic institutions working as they long have. No election denialism. Incumbents do not try not to leave office. There's no encouragement of violence. There's no erosion of checks and balances, no attacks on the free press, yada, yada, yada. Pretty much things are as they have always been, right? So the Liberal Democracy Index, that's from an organization called VDEM. You can see it's pretty much steady, no change. This is from Freedom House. Green just means free, right, as opposed to partly free, which is, what you can see has happened in places like Eastern Europe. Now, in many ways, this moderation of populism and this democratic resilience is pretty remarkable in Western Europe, given, again, very significant economic challenges. In fact, Europe has done worse in many ways than the United States has, less recovery from the pandemic and from the financial crisis, consistently slower growth. The immigration issue has remained a really difficult one in Western Europe, really very, very high immigration flows. And then I actually think the most remarkable comparison comes with our own country, the United States. Here we see something very different that has happened. We saw a right-wing party, a conservative party, that has moved from being conservative to what is clearly radical. And scholars agree that particularly since 2016, the quality of our democracy has declined. Quality, again, what do I mean? Checks and balances, functioning of institutions, no encouragement of violence, exception of election outcomes, all of these fairly standard things, scholars have found a noticeable decline. Now, I'm not suggesting this is a reason for complacency about what's going on in Western Europe. As we know from the very fact that we're in this room, democracy is fragile. It can decay quickly, and we know that from the American case. But I want to stop or end by saying that I think developments in Western Europe make two things clear. First, it's really important for those of us who think about democracy not to conflate policies we may not like or may not agree with policies that threaten democracy. What do I mean by that? So, parties or politicians that advocate restrictions on illegal immigration or frankly, even immigration more generally, advocating conservative or religious values, criticizing the EU or advocating for more national sovereignty. These are not anti-democratic policies. However, racism, ethno-nationalism, vilifying political opponents as enemies when they clearly are just people who differ from you on policy issues, ties to extremist, white supremacist, neo-Nazi organizations, condoning, encouraging violence, that is anti-democratic. We need to learn to differentiate between these two things. Second, the evolution of populism or the evolution of extremism should be seen as much as a symptom of democratic decay as a cause of it. So what do I mean by this? So presumably we have a panel on populism because we're worried about populism eroding or undermining democracy. That's correct. We should be concerned about those kinds of things. And Bill told us a little bit about that and how we might fight against it. But I think it's important to recognize that the evolution of populism or of extremism tells us something important about how resilient our democracy is. To put it another way, right, whether populists are going to represent a threat to democracy, whether they're going to be able to undermine it, right, depends not only on their intentions, but it depends a lot on the context within which they find themselves. So you're a lot of students in this room. If someone like Lenin or Hitler had been born in the United States in the late 19th century as opposed to being born in Russia or Germany, they would not have become the leaders of successful extremist revolutionary movements. Why? Not because their intentions would have been different, but because the context within which they found themselves were not conducive to the emergence of mass extremist movements, right? If democratic institutions and norms are strong, there will not be many people who are in favor of, who will vote for, who will support extremism. And in any case, government institutions and other political actors, other politicians, other elites, other parties will be able and willing to enforce the democratic rules of the game, to push back against extremists. So far, this has turned out to be the situation facing populists in Western Europe over the past couple of decades. In their extreme version, as I said, they did not get many votes. They were shunned by other parties and elites, and therefore unable to gain power in their extremist form at the national level. They were thus forced to jettison their extremist elements. And that they did this even in a place like Italy, which if any of you know anything about, right? This is a country that has never fully confronted its fascist past. It has been plagued by political instability and economic stagnation in decades, right? This is actually pretty remarkable. And it reveals that democracy in Western Europe was perhaps more resilient than many people thought. In contrast, American political development over the past years reveals that our democracy has had some very critical weaknesses that have left it very vulnerable to radicalism. I'll mention two, and then I'll stop. First, and I think we're going to talk about this more in the next panel, deep social cleavages regarding the legitimacy and nature of American identity and the related issue of how to deal with the legacies of slavery and racism. Also, of course, again, mentioned in the previous panel, not only growing economic, but growing political divides and social divides between rural and urban areas. The second, I would say, is a bunch of institutional weaknesses within our democracy. That is to say, institutions that promote the election of politicians who cater to extreme voters, as one of the questioners asked, cater to extreme voters rather than a broad range of voters. What do I mean by this? Primary system that gives a disproportionate influence to the most committed partisans, a huge number of safe districts in our country. Over 90% of House seats, for example, are more or less guaranteed to go to one party or another, which gives the politicians running in them absolutely no incentive to cater to anything other than the most extreme partisans. A voting system that allows candidates to win House and state level elections with a plurality rather than a majority of voters. All of these things are weaknesses that have really come, I think, to really hurt American democracy. And so I will stop there because I'm probably over time anyway. Thank you very much.
Did you want to make a follow-on remark? I saw you writing something.
We can go right to
Okay.
questions.
So anyone with a question, please step up to the microphone. Give you a minute there. Okay. I have plenty of questions if we run out. Go ahead.
Sir, you mentioned how anti-immigration is a populist perspective and it's negative to liberal democracy with, so U.S. Customs and Border Protection reported 22,000 Chinese nationalists attempt to enter the country illegally since October 1st. We have an increasing negative relationship with them in the South China Sea. There were 27,000 pounds of fentanyl seized at the border, which equates to about 37 million deadly doses for the 342 million Americans. Where should we draw the line on our immigration policy in terms of keeping a liberal democracy?
We need a functional, legal immigration system. Right now, we don't have it. The last time we had anything like comprehensive immigration reform in the United States was in 1986. The policies that are now operative are inadequate to the new dangers that we face. And, this is an issue that I've worked on for a long time. I could tell you a long, sad story of successive efforts to update our immigration laws that have failed, for various political reasons. And I think it's just obvious that as long as we don't have a functioning legal immigration system, there are going to be pressures to behave illegally on the part of prospective immigrants, and the overall consequences of this policy failure will exacerbate anti-immigrant sentiments. So this is a game for very high stakes. And if we don't solve the problem, it's going to get worse. And so I have a lot of sympathy with people, including many Republicans, who are attacking the current system as a colossal failure. It is. But it's not just a failure of one administration. It's a systemic failure. We should all look in the mirror and try to figure out how to get together around sensible new laws and policies.
Sir.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Thank you for coming. In 2016, Schubert and Schimpf wrote an article titled Friend or Foe, which states, or at least their thesis is about that left-wing populism, at least in Latin America, in the Latin American context, causes more damage to democratic quality and democratic institutions. With the current trends of right-wing populism in Europe and even Latin America and the United States, how do you foresee right-wing populism? Do you foresee right-wing populism having the same effect as left-wing populism had in Latin America in the 1990s and 2000s?
Thank you for that question. So yes, I spoke mostly about right-wing populism because that's as I said, the more popular form, so to speak, in Western Europe. But sure, there are left-wing versions of populism, and what they share underneath are some important qualities that Bill talked about. And the lack of commitment to the democratic rules of the game and the illiberal nature of these movements makes them a threat, regardless of whether they are ostensibly of the left and the right. If one does not prioritize the democratic rules of the game, or as we heard this morning, the fundamental principles of democracy over partisanship, over policies that one prefers, then the potential for decay is very, very clear. And the weaker the democracy is, the quicker that decay can happen. So populism in that form, again, if we define it as Bill said, it doesn't matter what it's for, whether it has a leftist or a right-wing tinge. If you are not committed to those rules, to those principles above everything else, then yes, the potential for decay is clear, and we've seen that in the left-wing version in Latin America. We've seen it in its more right-wing version in places like Eastern Europe.
I just want to express my strong agreement, with the distinction that Dr. Berman drew between policies you don't like, on the one hand, as opposed to anti-institutional moves that threaten the underlying constitutional order. And the reason that distinction is so important is if people in positions of power try to reject policies they don't like as per se illegitimate, illiberal, and unconstitutional, then the anger against the defenders of the status quo will continue to mount, because they will say, and this is what the meaning of this phrase that's become popular on the right in the United States, they will say that the uniparty, the elites of both political parties, are trying to constrict the range of legitimate debate in an undemocratic manner. And you know what? There's some truth to that.
Thank you. Next question.
Yeah, thank y'all for your talks. I'm wondering if y'all can speak to maybe the causal effect of the different ways we make social connections now since like the founding of Facebook, et cetera. And so I guess my question is kind of inspired by, Robert Putnam's work in Bowling Alone is over 20 years old at this point. And he, of course, makes this connection that deep communal social connections are a protector of democratic institutions, and he especially traces that in America and in Italy. And Italy was mentioned. So I was wondering if y'all's work has anything to say about the way our social connections have been changing over the course of the past 20 years that you guys are studying, and even what we can expect going into what a lot of, I think, sociologists and demographic experts are calling a loneliness crisis.
Sure, I'd be happy to start. That's a great question, and I think that's totally on target, and that's part of, I think, the reason why people are susceptible to the kinds of messages that sort of demonize the other, right? One of the most robust findings in political science, I would say, is that the cross-cutting ties are really crucial for helping us to see each other as fellow citizens as opposed to being part of the other. And one of the things that Putnam finds, right, is that our ability to interact with each other, the settings in which we can interact with each other as fellow citizens as opposed to, members of one ethnic group or another, or one partisan group or another, have really diminished over time. When he wrote that piece, his concern was about, sort of television. And how television was fragmenting our sort of social lives and making us spend more time alone. Well, knowing him, the rise of social media has done that even more, because it enables us to not only not interact in person with other people, which is crucial, but to only interact with people who are just having exactly the same views that we are. So absolutely, social connectedness, cross-cutting cleavages, these are incredibly important, and the data on how much they've declined in a place like the United States is really quite horrifying.
This is not a problem confined to the past 20 years. Recall that Putnam wrote his original article in the Journal of Democracy, the one that led to the book, Bowling Alone, 3 decades ago, right? And these trends were already well advanced. I agree with everything that Sheri just said. And in addition, there is a longstanding tradition of political and sociological analysis that I think hard to assess precisely, but intuitively makes a great deal of sense, that if what I might call horizontal ties thin out, but the desire to be part of something remains, that's likely to create more emphasis on what I'll call vertical ties, ties between leaders and followers. And so, and this is one of the arguments that Hannah Arendt makes in Origins of Totalitarianism. We've already heard references to Durkheim today. This is a long-standing argument, and some critics have linked it to the inherent trajectory of a capitalist market economy. We could have a long argument about that, but it's hard not to believe that the attenuation of civil society connections, coupled with the eternal human desire to belong, is creating new kinds of political belonging that are not good for liberal democracy.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And the last panel of today is going to deal with the effect of social media on democracy, too. So we'll get more into this issue. Sir.
Okay, actually, my question goes a little bit deeper than on that comment. And thank you both for your presentations. You certainly convinced me that populism is a very important threat to our liberal democracy. My question is, if in the coming presidential election, former President Trump does not win the election, what happens to the populist movement in America? And the reason I ask that is, there was already a populist sentiment. Some argue that President Trump tapped into that and deepened it and magnified it. How much of this populist movement is about a cult of personality based on the man? How much of it is enduring even after he is no longer, let's say, a presidential candidate with all that power and influence on existing Republican leaders and so on?
No, go ahead.
Well, we've already had a trial run. Mr. Trump was defeated in his effort for re-election in 2021 and in 2020. It's hard for me to see that the movement that he represents weakened in the wake of that defeat. But the question you're asking goes deeper than that, because the question is, does the movement go away if a single charismatic leader passes from the scene? Who knows? But I'll give you my intuition. I think the answer is no, because the most important effect of Donald Trump's entrance into national politics has been to organize and give voice and visibility to what was, when he stepped forward, a latent coalition of grievance and resentment. It's no longer latent, It's moved, as the Hegelians would say, from the in itself to the for itself. That's for the scholars in the audience. And I don't think that bell can be unrung. And various people will be vying to become the new leaders of the movement. And by virtue of being newer and somewhat hipper, as Sheri pointed out with her dramatic example from France, that could actually in some ways make this brand of politics more appealing to a broader coalition. I'm not saying that can happen. Rather, I'm not saying that will happen, but I'm saying it could happen, and we underestimate the force of the forces that have been unleashed if we trace it simply to the distinctive personality of a single leader.
Thank you. And then time for one more question.
I'm going to offer a case, and it's going to be extreme. I agree it's going to be extreme, but I intended to illustrate our commitment to anti-populism, or a commitment to what might be a democratic ideal or the Constitution. And if you don't like this as an example, find a less extreme one. I think the dynamics will continue to be there. So we are against populism, but it seems like I'm going to point to the case of John Brown and the Midnight Rising. Just before the Civil War, John Brown took over Harper's Ferry. This seems to have lots of characteristics of what you would call a populist movement. Propensity to violence, anti-constitutional. Are we willing to be consistent and say the impermissibility of this populist movement?
It's funny you should ask, because I just spent a few days, down in Austin, Texas, at a meeting, the centerpiece of which was scenario playing. Scenario playing, that might be called January 6th on steroids. And we hotly debated exactly that question. And you can always create a situation that's sufficiently extreme so that you are willing to abandon commitments that under any other circumstances you would hold fast to. In my judgment, it is important for the defenders of liberal democracy to defend it against all efforts to replace the rule of law with the rule of the gun. And that goes for violence that its perpetrators say is intended to defend liberal democracy against its enemies. Because if the defenders of liberal democracy are quick to abandon the line between law and violence, who will be left to defend that line? So I have a pretty clear answer to your question, and I would point out, that Abraham Lincoln, who took a very different path from John Brown's, was able not only to defend our constitutional institutions, but also to accomplish the objective that John Brown not only did not advance, but actually set back.
Well, I get the last question. I wanted to ask Sheri a question. I know your expertise is Europe, but are there any forms of populism in the Asian democracies? And if so, if not, why not?
So I guess that would sort of depend a little bit on the definition. It varies a little bit. There are some folks who would put, for instance, Modi and his sort of Hindu nationalist party in that category. I think that's stretching the category a little bit, but not entirely inappropriately. So yes, there are examples in non-Western contexts. India is a democracy of relatively long standing as well, so that sort of having been undermined is really quite a setback for democracy. And clearly what you see there is a party that was very much playing on, again, deep communal divides to whip up its supporters and to undermine all of the sort of institutions, I would say, at this point of democracy. I want to just, if I might, get back to the question that was just asked, because I think that's a very important and difficult one. I think there's two questions that are embedded in that's important for folks to care about democracy to think about. When, if at all, is non-parliamentary, even violent action appropriate? I would agree with Bill that once you go down that path, you are really inviting a cycle that is extremely difficult to control. But the second thing is, and this maybe just gets back to something I was saying before, it is very important to think about the reasons for one's actions. John Brown was fighting for ostensibly democratic principles. As your speaker this morning said, our Constitution has principles that up through the Civil War, in fact, up through the 1960s, obviously, were not, in fact, put into practice. So the principles that he was fighting for might very well have been democratic. The means, obviously, that he took were not only undemocratic but violent. And so when you look at things, I think it's very important to consider both of those things. I do not think that, whatever you want to call them, left or right-wing extremists today are fighting for anything akin to the kind of basic fundamental human values that John Brown was ostensibly fighting for. So I think it's very important to keep both of those things in our mind when we think about, again, the sort of appeal that, whatever you want to call it, political movements are making.
Just one last comment. You've heard about the United States and Western Europe. We haven't heard so much about, about India, about Turkey, about negative developments in Eastern Europe. So Western Europe presents the best case for the ability of strong democratic institutions to survive pressure from populists. But there are a lot of cases that are well south of the best, including not just India, Turkey, Hungary, Poland, a number of others, but also the United States itself. And so good news from Western Europe is good news from Western Europe.
Yeah. But nothing in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, no populism.
No, but interestingly, and this will be, I promise you, Ed, my last comment, I've been going to a political conference in Portugal for many years, and last year, I remarked prematurely, in a congratulatory tone, that Portugal had been spared a populist uprising. Well, I spoke much too soon because a new populist party in the past 12 months arose, just got 18% of the vote in the Portuguese elections. And I think this is attributable to the fact that center-right and center-left political parties, in the eyes of many people, have become indistinguishable, and they represent the status quo, and if you want change of any kind, you have to look outside the parties that have ruled in Western Europe for the since the end of the Second World War.
Well, thank you both. Let's continue the conversation over lunch, which is out the doors and up the stairs to the left. There's also an elevator. All the midshipmen who are here, you can eat. So you're invited to lunch upstairs. And thank you, Sheri and Bill. That was really informative. And let's plan on resuming at 25 after 1. Good job.